reflection is about the questions that we ask ourselves, and that we grow in the direction that we ask those questions. So if we ask the question, what is going wrong or what's going to happen later on, then that's dragging our attention away from there.
Is this facts or is this false? Because sometimes we tend to tell ourselves things over and over again. And at some point we realize that, actually it's not true. I've been telling myself this for 10 years in these situations over and over again. And now I realize it's not true. And hello, everyone. This is Ruth Lindroos, and with me today is Dr. Martin Dixon from San Francisco State University. And Martin Dixon is an experienced academic with 16 years of experience in teaching, writing publications, and presenting his work at international conferences. And also, you have operated as a professional UEFA licensed soccer coach in elite youth and college settings, and also worked with coaching education. So welcome. Really nice to have you. How are you feeling?
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Feeling good. Looking forward to this conversation about all things reflection.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it also. And related to reflection, you have completed your PhD examining coaches' experience of stress and coaches' use of reflection to manage performance demands. So with that is also your point of interest in your research. Yeah, basically today we're going to be looking at reflection in high performance environment, what reflection is, and how these reflection or reflective tendencies differ between individuals, different styles on reflection, and common misconceptions of reflection in the coaching practice, in coaching education. And then we're going to just finish off with some sharpening kind of tips on how the listeners can enhance their own reflective practice.
Great. Yeah, sounds good.
Yes. So let's start off by defining reflection. So what is reflection and why does it matter? Do you want to start off with that?
Sure. Yeah. Good place to start. I mean, there's been a lot of different definitions that have come out of academic literature, but really what it boils down to is learning from experiences. So thinking about our experiences to learn from them in a way that improves our future performance. So I guess one of the you've said misconceptions a bit later, but I'd probably start with one of those.
You can say it now already. Yeah.
Reflection is more than just thinking about something. It's thinking quite critically around what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then how can we use that new knowledge to improve what we do in the future. And I think this is important, certainly in coaching, which has been my area, but also in any profession, because there are different ways that we can learn and develop and improve our knowledge. Professional courses, going on workshops, now obviously a lot of content through social media, so many ways, speaking to colleagues. But we have to be able to apply that to our own strengths, our own style, and our own situation. And so reflection is the tool that pulls all of that together, really.
Yeah. So it can be a process to transform our experience of something into knowledge of something, and ideally kind of optimize our learning from that experience in a more constructive way than just thinking about something.
That's right. And there are different kind of models and processes. A really basic one that I was introduced to in sports coaching was like a plan, do, review process. And there are some more kind of complex models where we consider our resources and we design interventions, and then we evaluate those interventions or experiments in the field, and it's kind of a cyclical process. Some people just do it more intuitively. others might benefit from having a model or a process
Mm,
initially to follow to encourage more structured and in-depth thinking rather than it just being, I'm driving home on the way back from a practice or on the way back from teaching or working with a client, and
mm,
I'm just kind of thinking it over. Because the problem with that one is we might have certain thought patterns or
mm,
almost
mm.
go-to responses, and it's difficult to break out of that and learn anything new. So yeah,
Yes.
sometimes a learner might benefit from a more structured process or cycle, rather than just that, I guess, that intuitive way of evaluating
Mm,
their
mm.
session or their practice.
Yeah. Also, because our thought patterns can be unconscious sometimes to us that we're not putting so much attention on them. And then when I'm thinking about reflection and why it matters and why it's important, especially why it would be important to have some kind of a process around it, maybe one thing is that we are kind of in this span of constant change in our life, but it's going both ways. So what's happening around us is in some ways changing us, but also what we're doing is affecting what's happening around us, especially as a coach. So if you're kind of unconscious and you're not paying attention or you're not seeing some things, it's impossible to start changing them because it's out of like our own reality, out of our own thought patterns. So when we use reflection, it can maybe be a sort of a filter between the changes that are happening around us and then kind of moving on to our own personal strengths and so forward, and how to use those strengths in order to bring us closer to where we want to go. But we need some process of reflective learning on this two-way change process and what's happening around us. I don't know if that makes sense to you. This
Yeah,
was my thought.
yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the main, I guess, benefits of
Mm,
reflection if we do it well is that it increases our awareness of what we're doing.
yeah.
Because, and I think particularly if you've been in a profession or doing something for so long, then we might just get into like patterns of behavior or ways of doing things without any real awareness of what we're
Mm,
doing and also why we're doing it. And as you mentioned, what is the impact of what we're
mm,
doing? And that's why it's really useful to consider different reflective prompts,
mm,
just to trigger reflection in different ways. So a couple that I've experienced in coaching that have been really effective are video analysis of your own
mm,
coaching,
mm.
of your own practice. At first, the first time I did this, it's quite difficult to watch. When you see a video of yourself and you're thinking, okay, do I really sound like that? Do I really look like that? But actually, it was really important because it made me aware of how I interacted with athletes, um,
Yeah,
how I interacted with athletes differently. Why was I doing that? What impact
yeah.
might it have on their mentality, on their experience? So
Mm,
the in that case, the video analysis was a useful trigger for me,
mm,
to start raising my awareness about what I was doing, why I was
mm,
doing it. Another one that has been part of my research is the collaborative reflection between
mm,
coaches or between a coach and their mentor. So somebody that we can have a kind of a reflective conversation
mm,
with. Even if we don't call it that, it might be something really informal. We don't necessarily call up a mentor or a colleague and say, "Do you want to have a reflective conversation?" But
mm,
we're just
mm,
we're just talking about what we do,
mm,
and we're questioning each other and generating ideas in ways that help us, maybe consider what we're doing now and how it's working.
mm.
So, so yeah, coming back to your point there, I think that is key. It's raising and enhancing our awareness of what we do, the impact it has, and also
Mm,
the awareness of our own thought processes. Like, how
mm.
do I currently think and reflect?
Yeah, exactly. So we have kind of an opportunity to become active agents in our own processes, in our own lives, and not just be the passive passengers that are just being taken somewhere and we're not really putting awareness on the why and how and what's really happening around us. But related to the different types of reflections, like you mentioned, you can look yourself in the video. I know that the first times I saw myself on video, I was just like, oh no. Like the moment the video started, like, oh no, like, do I really look like that? But that can be really effective, or reflective conversations, or these modeling processes. But in any case, there are different reflective tendencies of people, mm, non-dependent on which model we are looking at. And some people are more prone to look at the negatives and look at the mistakes. And then some people are more like adjusted to look for the strengths, like what am I doing well? And would you say there's some reason why others turn to the negatives with the reflection and the mistakes, and others turn to the positives?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, this has been a big theme that's come out of research into reflection in sports coaching, not just in my research, but broader, amongst coaches from a different range of levels and countries. That as coaches, we tend to reflect on problems and negatives. Now, I also wonder, maybe that's more just a human thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we're more likely to do that. And I'll experience it now as an educator after I've watched a student coach, and the first thing I might say was, "How was it?" Just something
Mm,
open, and they'll probably, the first thing will probably be something that they didn't do well, and
yeah.
I don't know if that's because they want to get to that before, because they think I'm going to critique it, so they want to show they're aware of the mistakes or the weaknesses. So maybe it's a human thing, but certainly within the field of coaching, and I think a couple of explanations there. Firstly, when we're training as coaches and going through coach education courses, we're
Mm,
taught to solve problems. We're taught
mhm,
to
mhm,
identify errors and
mm,
fix mistakes and solve problems. So most of what we do is around what we might call a negative aspects of performance, right?
mm,
Mistakes, problems, errors. We're taught to be able to identify them and correct them and fix them, which obviously there's a good reason for. We've got to look
mm,
for what our players are not doing so well,
mm,
how and how they can improve in that sense. So there's a good reason for that. So we've kind of become trained to look
mm,
for problems, and then maybe that also spills over into how we think about ourselves. So we're looking
mhm,
for problems and errors and mistakes in ourselves. And again, there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, but it can have some
mhm,
disadvantages if that's all we do. So yes, one explanation is kind of our training and education as problem solvers and
mhm,
finders. The other one, more from the academic literature, is that
mhm,
most of the research into sports coaching reflection borrows from the work of Donald Shun,
mhm,
whose work on the reflective practitioner. It was seminal work, and you'll see it cited all the time. It's kind of informed a lot of the literature and the research into sports coaching. Now, Shun defined reflection as finding
mhm,
dilemmas in practice and problems. So again, it was very
mhm,
much about finding issues and problems and dilemmas, and then how we experiment with different solutions,
mhm,
and then reflect on those, which has been a really useful model. It's also important to point out that Donald Shun, it was important work, and it's informed a lot of what we do as coaches, but it wasn't actually a kind of solid, like high quality evidence. It was a
mhm,
series of observations. It was quite unstructured um,
mhm,
research. There's obviously been a lot more thorough, expansive research conducted since then.
mhm,
And but we tend to have, in the coaching and academia world, we tend to have bought into kind of the Donald Shun way of
mhm,
reflection, which is about dilemmas and problems and how we might address those. So yeah, a couple of
mhm,
reasons there, um, as to why coaches might focus more on the negatives or on mistakes and weaknesses. And I guess there's a couple of important distinctions there, because focusing on a mistake doesn't necessarily mean it's negative, because we could address a mistake in a
mhm,
constructive way, or we could
mhm,
address a mistake in a way that's more destructive. Right.
Mm,
So again, focusing on problems and mistakes and errors isn't necessarily negative or bad, but
mm,
there is also a line to be drawn around reflecting on what's gone well and what are our strengths, and
mm,
also
mm,
what we're not doing well and what are our flaws.
mm. Yes, and perhaps coaches also are scouting and more for the negatives because there is a certain sense of identity investment they may have in what they're doing, and they want to be as good as possible in what they're doing to kind of build like this better feeling about themselves. It's not like necessarily the right way to go, but naturally coaching is something that people really do care about what they're doing, and they want to have a really good performance. So it does quickly turn into like, okay, if this performance goes now wrong from my team, then it says something about me as a coach, and then it turns into a threat, and we're trying to eliminate the threat by scouting the negatives and in some way shielding the self. But of course, then there's also the problem with that we have with the negative emotions, that they tend to start narrowing our attention and narrowing a bit on our like cognitive abilities to see the full picture and different solutions and so forward. So I think it can also be a bit risky for coaches to only focus on the problems and only focus on like what could have been done better, because those will never end from the performance climate, which is constantly moving. But then on the other hand, we do seem to have a lot of support for the reflection through the positives, through like the broaden and build theory, as I understand, on positive emotions, that, for instance, these positive emotions both signal and produce optimal functioning, because when we're more in a positive state, then we are like broadening our thought action tendencies. So basically meaning cognitions and enhancing attention and broadening a bit our capability for creativity, seeing different options, open-mindedness, flexibility, accepting the mistakes made when they happen, but perhaps going like past them a bit faster than we would be in a negative state where we tend to start ruminating on those mistakes. So, and then also the building part, that by these positive emotions we're kind of building our personal resources, psychological resilience, and maybe a feeling of self-efficacy that we can actually do this, and then again showing as resilience in the climate, which is changing fast and there's lots of twists and turns. So I suppose there is a lot of evidence on the reflecting through positives, and I think you have wrote about that also in your publications, at least in the different kind of tendencies to reflect. So how does it show in the coaching atmosphere? Is it like something that can be integrated in the climate to reflect through the positives? And is that kind of a transformation that coaches are willing to undergo, or do they more want to stick with this more traditional dilemma-based reflection?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yeah, it's almost like there's this idea of a flawless performance that we're trying to get to, where there's no
Mm,
errors, right? We're constantly trying to iron out errors. So we've got
mm,
this flawless performance, which isn't going to happen, right? Because
mm,
there's no perfect performance, from athletes, players, or from the coach themselves. Um, and as you say, the coach is also slightly removed from that, so they've got less control, even though they
mm,
feel responsible. Obviously, they influence their athlete's performance, but to feel responsible for the athlete's performance, the athlete's performance reflects what they do as a coach. Um, so that's got other issues in terms of the psychological responses to
mm,
reflection. So yeah, that's been a big part of my research with reflection in sports coaching.
mhm,
Initially, reflection was studied just in terms of, I guess, learning and professional development
mm,
and education. Um, the way I've been looking at reflection considers those aspects, but also the psychological and emotional um, process and outcomes of reflection. And as you mentioned, there are these different directions that we could take, whether we're reflecting more on mistakes and weaknesses versus strengths and areas of success. Positive performance can have a big impact on how we feel about what we're doing. So you mentioned there this idea of the broaden and build theory of positive emotion, that if we experience positive emotion through joy, through interest, then what that does is it actually gives us a broader capacity to think. So we talked about a benefit of reflection and a purpose of reflection being enhancing our awareness of what we do, awareness of our own strengths. And positive emotion can help us to do that. Versus if we have more negative emotion and we're feeling anxious, or we're going through that rumination process, we might be a bit more tunnel vision and have less access to those resources, and not be able to think as creatively, make effective decisions. I think I might have strayed from the question a bit there. There was a lot.
It's
There was a
okay.
lot going on that I
We can
wanted to get
stream
at.
as much as we want during this conversation. It's all good, and it's all like they're all related to each other. But I think these are important points to come out also, because for somebody, like when we say reflection, they may think that, oh, it's rumination, because their tendency to reflect with think is to ruminate with the thought processes, or, oh, this reflection, it means these thought patterns that I have, like that's reflection. But I think they're all a bit different, though. They're not like the same thing. So what would you say, what is the difference between reflection process, rumination, and thought patterns as is?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question, because there's a lot of overlap there. And I've started to look a bit more deeply into the idea of rumination, because I think there was a misconception in coaching and education generally that reflection is just this great thing. Right? Reflection is like, the cure for everything. Reflection can help us grow. But reflection, again, depending on how we reflect, reflection in itself is not necessarily good or bad. Right, but it's how we do it. Are we doing it in a way that's more constructive, where we're solving problems, we're coming up with solutions, we're building on strengths, or is reflection a process in which we're becoming overly critical of what we do, and we can't stop thinking about these errors. And this was an area that I really wanted to study, and it started off, I was asking coaches about reflection, about how they reflect during times of stress, like when they're feeling under pressure in a job. And one of the coaches had said that for her, reflection was like a wheel that wouldn't stop turning until she had an answer. And another coach had talked about how during times of stress that they were reflecting so much they couldn't sleep. So that made me think, well, is this reflection or is it something else? Is this now rumination? So that's where there could be a difference. Rumination is a negative thought pattern. That's how it's classified. Reflection is not necessarily like a good or a bad, a helpful or an unhelpful. It can go either way. But with rumination, this is something that is negative. It's repetitive. And there's also a bit more of a rumination tends to be more passive. It tends to be more something that's happening to us rather than being active and something that we're as aware of. But I do think there's some awareness involved in that rumination process. It's something that we might trigger ourselves as well. But yeah, they're the distinctions. But there is a distinction. There's different ways of measuring reflection and rumination. They've got their own kind of questionnaires, and they're defined in different ways. But also there seems to be quite a bit of crossover and a blurred line between, certainly if we're reflecting a lot on negative experiences, and how that could maybe tip over into rumination.
Yeah, and it kind of tips on over the psychological profile of the person doing it, because if they don't have other tools to reflect except to ruminate, then that's it. Like they're kind of stuck in that trajectory. But also, even when we are reflecting through the positives or attempting to reflect through the positives, there is a point where this positive kind of or attempted positive reflection turns from adaptive reflection, which is more constructive, adaptive to the situation, realistic to the situation, to a self-protective reflection mechanisms that we are actually beginning to shield the self and reflect from the place of denial, that we are denying like our mistakes, or we're denying anything negative, and we're only trying to push on the positive. So when somebody points to us like, hey, you did this and this could have been better, and maybe next time you can consider this alternative, we just put this shield and completely deny that factor. And that can also be tricky to notice, because I think people in general, everyone is operating from a base of self-bias, at least to some point, that we have these biases coming from our beliefs and thought patterns. So maybe always we're not able to distinguish when we're reflecting through positive, like in an adaptive way, or are we reflecting on positive through these kind of negative mindsets of shielding the self and denying the mistakes. So would you have any tips on how to distinguish the two?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting point around reflecting on something that's gone well, let's say
Mm,
successful performance. It is not always going to be beneficial. Reflect on something, an unsuccessful performance isn't always going to be bad, right? So
mm,
we can reflect on failure and defeat and mistakes in a way that stimulates growth because we're coming up with it. But it's the important um, principle here is that it's solution based. And that's where with the rumination, we're not actually finding a solution. We're just kind of cyclically going over the problem and thinking about the negative aspects of a problem. But similarly, it's also with this idea of strengths-based reflection.
yeah.
It's important not to deny or neglect things that are going wrong. Like they still need to be addressed. We can't just kind of gloss over that.
Mm,
And again, working with coaches, I've certainly had reflective conversations where they might only talk about the strengths of what they've done, and maybe it's either not being aware of some areas that they could improve, or some things that they could
mm,
be doing better, or maybe it's an unwillingness to not go there, and as the term you use there, being more self-protective.
mm,
um, and I think for coaches it is quite difficult to be vulnerable and to admit what you're doing wrong at times,
mm,
because
mm,
then we might think, well, if our players or athletes see that and we're even saying that we're doing things wrong, then does that
mm,
impact their belief in me and my kind of reputation and my standing within the team? So yeah, there could be a reluctance there to address it. There is something wrong, in
mm,
what we're doing, and that we're growing. Um, this idea that as a coach we're kind of we're kind of bulletproof, and we don't get things wrong, because if we
mm,
show that, then our athletes might lose some faith in us. So yeah, I think there could also be an issue if we go too far the other way, where we're focusing so much on positives. And maybe it's better to go away from positive and more talking about strengths and deficits,
mm,
rather than positive and negative, or good and bad,
mm, mm.
because there's benefits for both, for us to be reflecting on our deficits,
Yeah.
and trying to minimize those, and also trying to expand and develop on our strengths.
Yes, so maybe one anchor of a pragmatic reflection is that it's solution based, as you say, and one anchor is that you are moving somewhere, that you're not repeating the same pattern over and over again, whether it be on the strengths or on like the deficits, that we are actually like moving ourselves, that we are challenging ourselves to do things differently and challenging our patterns and thought patterns. So in this sense, we're like in a motion. So because one thing that is coming to me in this like conversation, an idea that okay, one risk of reflection is to get stuck, in reflection also, whether it be like the strength-based or deficit-based, that people are kind of good in developing some comfort zone of doing things. And it's not necessarily about is it helpful for them or unhelpful for them. It's just what they're used to doing. So one process of good, effective, reflective strategy could be that it is actually moving you somewhere out of that comfort zone as well. And yeah, moving from that, how would you say that pressure affects reflection and different reflective tendencies?
Mhm. Yes, yes. So this has been kind of the combination of two fields that I've been interested in. You know,
Mm,
certainly stress, which might be kind of induced by pressure,
mm,
um, and how reflection might be used to help us perform well during times of stress or being under pressure. Um, you know, one of the models that I've used to look at that is the challenge and threat theory, that we can respond to pressure or stress or what they call motivated performance situations. So a time when it's really important to me, when it really matters, and
mm,
a time when I might be feeling that pressure. So how we respond to that is based on our perceptions of our resources and demands. So our resources, essentially our strengths, our knowledge, our skills, our abilities, and maybe also our social support. So our relationships with those around us, and also the sense of control and autonomy that we have. Um, so that's our resources, and the demands being, the potential threats to our performance, whether it's
mm,
threats to reputation, whether it's threats to our self-esteem,
mm,
um, whether it's the uncertainty of a situation that can be quite threatening as well. And particularly within sport, there's a lot of uncertainty, and
mm,
especially if it's a, an open kind of invasion game. You're thinking, the soccer, basketball, or a net, tennis, where we don't know. A lot of it is dependent on the opponents, dependent on the official, it's dependent on potentially teammates. So we might have different perceptions of control. So bringing it back, challenge and threat theory, our perception of our resources, if that can match or outweigh our perception of demands, then we go into this
mm,
challenge state and we can experience it as a challenge. But if we don't perceive that we've got the resources to meet the demands, then we can experience that situation as a threat. And it's so dynamic, it's so ever changing, it's in flux,
mm,
it's iterative. So we might approach the same situation. We've got to we've got to do some public speaking, or we've got an interview. We could approach that in very different ways, because
mm,
one day we're very much aware of our resources and strengths, and we feel in control, and other days we're not. So even the same situation, but at a different time, we can have very different responses to. So that's kind of the framework that I've used to study how coaches respond in times
mm,
of stress or when they're under pressure.
mm,
Um, and reflection can play a part in that, because, again, we're talking about resources. If our perceptions of resources can help us deal with demands, then reflection could be a tool that we use to help improve our awareness of our resources. Like, how do we know about what we're actually good at if we're not reflecting on it? And I think when we see somebody as a good performer, whether it's an athlete or a coach, we assume that they know that they're good,
mm,
and why they're good, but that's not necessarily the case. So
mm, mm,
asking these kind of reflective questions and using reflective prompts is really useful to enhance our awareness of our resources, our skills, our knowledge, our style, what we're good at. And that can help us manage those demands and hopefully experience that situation as more of a challenge rather than as a threat.
yeah. You have a kind of two-way lane. You can experience pressure as a challenge, and then you can experience pressure as a threat. And I think one thing that kind of comes again here is also like the effect on our attention. So I could imagine that in the threat states, it begins again this negative emotional effect when our attention starts to like narrow down. And then perhaps in the challenge states, the attention maybe keeps a bit more wide for coaches to assess certain situations of the performance at hand. And I think also attentional narrowing, when we're talking about pressure and its effect on reflection, can occur in either state, in the sense that when the pressure comes, it kind of, how do I say, accelerates the existing trajectories we have. So maybe somebody can experience stress more positives, but like they're still experiencing the stress and are a bit more hyped up. But then, especially if we're experiencing stress as more negative, threat based, then I think it can start really to accelerate the thought processes around the threats and putting the attention on the threats, and then again kind of narrowing our attention, narrowing our capacity to reflect, at least in situations. So would you say this is something that occurs, or no?
Yeah, definitely the attentional narrowing, almost the tunnel vision of,
Mm,
which is associated with a threat state. And I've seen in the research that coaches will try and become more controlling of athletes, because they're trying to force something to go well when it's not, and
mm,
maybe being excuse me, maybe being hyper focused on some of those errors, versus in the challenge state where we've got more capacity to draw on what we're good at, more capacity to draw on our knowledge, because there's this idea of reflection in action. So
mm,
how we reflect actually during a coaching session, and or during a game, and we've still got to
mm,
make decisions, and we can still impact the performer, and impact the game. And in those cases, we need access to, our decisions, our knowledge base, our experiences.
mm, mm,
So being in the challenge state can help us to do that, versus being in the threat state. It's going to be very challenging. One of the other factors that we've seen associated with challenge and threat in coaching is the ideas of approach versus avoidance focus. So, this is called the goal orientation. That within a threat state, we're more approach focused. So we see that pressured situation as a challenge. So we've got a difficult game, an opponent. We see that as a chance to go and to show how good we are, to go and express our skills and our abilities, and kind of take on the challenge, versus an avoidance focus, which is trying to minimize errors and be seen as kind of less incompetent,
mm.
right? So rather than a drive to be incompetent, it's an avoidance and a drive to avoid being seen as incompetent. So, in that case, kind of behavioral range and our thought processes might be more limited.
And it's interesting also what you said, the points of that when there is an audience, or when we're looking at a performance of someone else or a coach, and we are looking from the outside and we're like, oh, they're very good in what they do. They probably know that they're really good in what they do. And then on the other hand, the experience of that person in the performance can be completely different. Like when the pressure is starting to get on top of them, so to speak. And then sometimes people are wondering, like, well, why did they freeze? Why did they make this beginner level mistake? They're so professional, they're so like competent. But I think one misconception here is that when the pressure starts to affect our thought processes, cognition, so forward, it has really little to do with like our mental toughness and our motivation, and like, the want to be there and want to coach. And that it's more like when the attention starts to narrow, it's all about our processing style of the situation. Like, what is the situation interpretation for us? What are we setting our attention on? And as you say, for instance, in this threat state, perhaps the attention goes on perceived like negative outcomes, negative consequences, what might happen if the performance goes wrong. Now, the consequences can be true or they can be false. They can be something what would actually happen, or they can be in our imagination. But it doesn't matter, because that's where attention is on at that moment, and it kind of starts to expand, and it's taking away our attention from everything else that's going on. Or then this aspect of freezing that when you said about control, that we start to really overly monitor every move we are making when the pressure is on, and we're kind of switching from this automatic processing to a somewhat clumsy working memory that can occur sometimes, that we're then starting to freeze or making beginner level mistakes, basically because we're going into this paralysis by analysis states, all like what's happening inside our processing mentally. Much, I believe, coming from what you say, that is this like a threat? Like, am I under threat? Like, what should I put my attention on? Is it the negative outcomes, or is it something I'm doing wrong if I'm losing control of the situation? Or then again, is it a challenge where I could assume that this attentional span keeps wide, and we're not starting to push ourselves into this little box of the situation, that we're losing the capacity to reflect and see everything and the situation as is, really, in reality, not
Mm.
spinning out of control. um, can reflection help us spot these thought patterns or thought mechanisms in the situation, in pressure?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think it's really difficult because when you're in that moment, to get out of that, and you've mentioned the phrase kind of reflective styles, reflective tendencies, that we might have these kind of go-to thought processes that we've had for a long time, and so to disrupt those might need some work. But I think that's the important part of the research that that I've been doing, is how can we actually help coaches to do this and to respond and perform effectively under pressure. So I'm going to go back to a phrase one of my old colleagues, Professor Tony Guy. He said that reflection is about the questions that we ask ourselves, and that we grow in the direction that we ask those questions. So if we ask the question, what is going wrong or what's going to happen later on, then that's dragging our attention away from there. And again, we're becoming less responsive to what's actually there. We're
Mm,
accessing fewer resources versus maybe having some anchors. And this is how I guess coaches could use reflection to perform under pressure, is have some go-to questions for themselves when they're in those situations. It's almost like a little script for them to have, because we know that adversity is going to happen. If we're
yeah.
talking about if we're talking about life, there's going to be adverse situations. There's going to be times when things are going wrong. Maybe we don't train for those enough. Like, do we
Mhm,
train for being, 2 goals down, or for having a player sent off? Do we practice for that? But adversity is going to happen. So maybe we could have some reflective prompts that can help
mhm,
to anchor and I guess maintain our awareness, maintain being present in the moment and our ability to solve problems, versus having these other thoughts around, this is going to be terrible if we lose, what's going to happen,
mm,
and you kind of already going towards that defeat. So yeah, maybe having some questions, whether it's questions that can help you and stay rational at that time, or whether it's questions that can just help you engage with the performance. I always have one coach in soccer. Whenever's happening in a game, I'll always ask myself, where is the space?
mm,
Because there's only so much space that the opposition team can cover. So there's got to be some space. I'll always ask myself, where is the space? And that from there, I can come
yeah.
up with some kind of strategy and solution for the problem that's on the field. So whether it's whether this reflective question is something that's kind of technical or tactical, or whether it's something more to do with our own process,
Mm,
I think that's useful, that coaches have got those when they're going into a performance that they can lean
mm,
back on, rather than this thought process that kind of spirals out of
yeah.
control and takes them away from solutions.
Yes, and when we're in the spiraling, we're hardly in a place of innovation in that moment. So I suppose when we're thinking of these prompts, maybe it's more beneficial to do that thinking and innovative work on reflection, on action, like what has happened. It's, I suppose, one thing which could be helpful would be spotting patterns. Like, if you are a coach, and you are coaching a team and you're going through competitions, and there's something that is happening over and over and over again. It can be something that's happening with the team, but it can also be something that's happening with your performance in the competition, like over and over and over again. It could be very perhaps beneficial to spot the pattern, the mechanism, like, okay, this is something that's reoccurring, and start doing the questioning around that reoccurring mechanism when we're in a place of calm and safe and so forward, and not under pressure, not under threat, to see what kind of questions we could ask ourselves about that mechanism that's happening over and over again. Or on the other hand, we could similarly do the pattern spotting, but with something that is missing. That we want something to happen, but that thing is always missing. Like, why is it missing? And start questioning that. How does that sound to you?
Yeah. It reminds me of a phrase that's come up in the coaching literature quite a bit, which is reflecting on critical incidents. Um,
Mm,
so finding again, coming back to the idea of the problem, I guess, but it's something that was a
mm,
big problem and then addressing that, which I guess makes sense. But these critical incidents can kind of dominate our thinking.
mm,
Let's say the performance was, an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours. This one thing that happened can then just dominate how we reflect and what we've taken from that performance. Um, so rather than just thinking about the critical incident, I think it's useful to also reflect on what we do most of. Like what are our typical behaviors? How do we typically interact? As you say, what are these things that are coming up time and time again?
mm,
So being aware of those, but because it's our typical behavior, we might not be aware of it naturally, and that's where things like having somebody trusted, experienced who can watch us and critique us, or whether it's the video, whether it's also talking to our athletes and our players and having more of a reflective conversation with them, and just generally find out what works for them, getting their feedback. Um,
yes. Yes, and spotting the thought patterns. Is there something I'm telling myself over and over again, and then kind of stopping on that? Is this facts or is this false? Because sometimes we tend to tell ourselves things over and over again, and some point we realize that, actually it's not true. I've been telling myself this for 10 years in these situations over and over again, and now I realize it's not true. So also, I suppose one thing is the span of control, like what we should be focusing, what do I actually have control over? And then the other is that, am I like telling the things to myself that are actually true, that are actually pragmatic? Or is it a thought that has been born at some place and time, and I'm not exactly sure when or who told me this, but I've been repeating it ever since, to have a more evidence-based or critical look at our self-talk in these situations also.
hmm, interesting. Yeah. I think that's a really useful phrase. Is it evidence based? Where is this thought pattern or reflective tendency coming from? And it's interesting how quickly we forget what we've done well in the past.
Yes,
And
that's true.
this was one of the, I guess, one of the key recommendations that came from speaking to coaches was when they're in those times of stress, pressure, things aren't going very well for them. A couple of things, thinking about what they've been successful at before. So thinking
Mm,
about previous successful experience to improve their self-confidence now and maybe give them some tools. Now, maybe the situation isn't exactly the same as it was before,
mm,
but just knowing that they've been successful before, maybe giving them that bit more belief, and remembering how they adjusted to that situation, and also how they've dealt with stressful situations in the past. It's like, okay, well, I've been here before. The world didn't end. Nothing really bad happened. In fact, it ended up being okay. So being able to think back to some of those times again, maybe that could be another part of our compass, something that we come back to. That we've had these experiences in the past where we we have worked through it and we've been successful. We have performed under pressure, reminding ourselves of those because in the moment it can be difficult to think
mm,
about that. We forget some of those times when we've done well.
mm. Yes, and this resource-based analysis or mapping, thinking also from what you mentioned about challenge and threat stage, that when we feel resourceful enough to meet a demand, then it's more likely we experience it as a challenge. So really question ourselves, like, okay, what are my personal resources? What are my personal skills? What are my social resources? Who do I have these relationships with who can help? What are the resources of my team? What are the resources like tangible equipment, time, so forward, perhaps finance, to really look at all the resources like, okay, I have all this, like I can do
Mm.
it. Because sometimes we also forget what our resources are. When we go to this state of ruminating, we get very like narrow in again where we are putting the attention on, and we forget like who can actually help us in the situation, who has done this before and been successful and so forward, meeting this particular demand. In the case that if it's a new demand for us, we can also always ask help to kind of prepare ourselves from someone who has done it previously. And yeah, let's move on to the coaching educators. So, interesting question. What are common misconceptions of reflection in how coaches are educated, in coaching education, or coaching practice in general? What is generally misunderstood?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a tricky one because some coach educators might be obviously doing things differently, but
Mm,
speaking from what I've experienced and what I've seen, and when I've spoken to other coaches both in the UK and in the US, and first of all, reflection is not really a skill that's taught.
mm,
Typically on coach education courses, it's more around the technical and the tactical aspects of a sport. It's more around the what to coach, and understanding a sport at a high level and those details. So I've not really seen reflection as a skill that's taught, and I think this is where the misconception might be between evaluation and reflection.
yeah.
Evaluation is part of a reflection, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Mm,
And I'll see this a lot with, working with students and coaches. If I ask them to reflect, it's all about how did the session go? Okay, the players did well at this bit of practice. This practice wasn't so good. It doesn't really generate much self insight.
mm,
And that's when I come back to that point around reflection is not necessarily helpful or unhelpful. It can go either way. Um, Reflection is useful if it's reflection that generates self insight. So, self knowledge. If I learn about myself a bit more, I learn from that experience more, versus just thinking about it. So I think that could be a misconception that reflection is evaluation, and those two are the same
mm,
things. Um, and I guess reflection on coach education courses has typically been written as well. So if it is in the form of evaluation, it's okay. Evaluate your sessions, evaluate your practice, and write that down. And I think it can be useful. I think that writing things down can be really, really powerful, right? Because it can help you retain that information. Whereas if we just
mm,
think about it and then it's gone and we've not recorded it. So I do
mm,
think that writing and kind of recording our reflections is useful. But sometimes there's a problem with how it's done on academic courses or in coach education. Write it down. It becomes like homework. It becomes an assignment. It becomes a chore. And I've already got lots of chores and homework and assignment. I don't need another one on reflection. So I think this is very much an individual preference of how that person is going to reflect effectively. Some people might like the written aspect, and that's typically how it's done because on a course, we have to be able to evaluate it. So,
mm,
from the educator's point of view, or from a university or a national governing body point of view, we've got to be able to like see something and kind of grade that, something that we can comment on and give it a pass or a fail. But it might not be the best way to encourage that reflection. It might be more informal ways. It might be more collaborative ways. It might be using different materials. We've talked about the video. We've talked about mentorship, collaborating with colleagues. Um, Perhaps it's blogs and it's more social media. Really, it's whatever you can do to trigger that growth and it might look different for different people. So I guess having a more flexible, kind of individualized approach to promoting reflection in coaches would be
Mm.
useful.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was thinking of misconceptions or misunderstandings of reflective practice and what they can be, but then now I understand that it's generally not something that is taught like as itself, as a practice, as a model or different models of reflections, more evaluation. So I could assume that in many places, guidance on reflective practices is generally missing or lacking. So that's interesting. Um, but yeah, when I'm thinking about misconceptions, even if the reflection process is lacking, there are still some that I could see happening in coaching education. And you see this in other educators also, not just coaching. So in business, business places, different firms, cooperative kind of cooperation fields. There's one that is this one size fits all mentality that, they have someone who was very successful. Let's say it's a coach, it's an athlete, it's a business leader, and they will be invited to come in and tell everyone how you did it and what were your like thoughts around this and what you focused on, and then tell the people like, okay, now do what they say and you will become successful as well. This is something I see a lot in business. And then the truth about it really is that um, it what works for someone, it really does not necessarily work for someone else. So there's a complete like lack of acknowledging individual differences in the individual processing on in different situations, in like the pressure or these kind of circumstances and in performance. So that's interesting. And then probably generally maybe this over orientation on some traditions in sport, which are motivation, mental toughness, rigidity, and what we're able to control and what we should be controlling, where again in the performance environment it's more about being comfortable with the lack of control than attempting to control everything that is moving, because then again it takes us away from being present to what we're supposed to be doing in that situation. So those are just some of like my opinions that came up, maybe true, maybe not, but something general I see. And then there was one thing I wanted to ask, how comfortable in general are coaching educators in what they do not know? And do they encourage other people in the education, for instance, to acknowledge what they do not know?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that there's definitely a lot of protection in coach education around knowledge exchange, because often as
Mm,
coaches we might see each other as competitors as well.
mm, true.
So I mentioned earlier on about that idea. I don't want to reflect any of my negatives or anything that could improve, because it might show that I'm not that good.
Mm,
But also, if we are doing something well, maybe we want to keep it to ourselves, And so I think there's some of that, and there's a lot of impression management that goes on in that world. But I think I think it was a really interesting point you made around just following, somebody that's been successful and trying to follow
mm,
that, exactly what they do. It actually made me think about podcasts. That podcasts tend to have people already successful on, and what
mm,
can we learn from them, which is useful. But then this is where the reflection is really important on ourselves, because that person, a top athlete or a top coach or a top business leader, did this, it doesn't mean follow what they did, because it was a different time, it was a different situation, they're a
mm,
different person, maybe they had different advantages. Um, so, and I did that myself. I would read books from famous coaches or about famous coaches, top coaches, and I just try and do that. And I guess the trying things isn't necessarily bad, but also having an awareness of, well, their players are completely different. They've got different resources. Um, so that's where the reflection is useful, because we can learn a lot from those individuals, but we have to ask the question, how is this going to work for me? What are the bits that won't apply to me? There are some bits. It's interesting that they did this. They used this strategy. They said these things that behave like this, but that's not going to work for me. I've
Mm,
got a different skill set, different situation. Um, so reflecting on what isn't going to work, and also reflect on how you could adapt
mm, mm.
their
Yes.
lessons yourself, rather than in an uncritical way. We just kind of follow it blindly and try and
Mm.
be like that other person, which probably isn't going to end well.
Yeah, generally no. And then this thing, what I asked about, coming forward and admitting to what you don't know as an example to others, it's something that came up in my mind because, in general, when we are being and performing in a field of psychology or like just day to day life, and we want to develop ourselves or we want to understand better someone else. So, if you're a coach and you want to understand your athletes, so it's really all about understanding another person, understanding how somebody's mind is working, the thought trajectories, and so forward. So it's understanding something that we cannot ever know completely, even when it's about ourselves, because we're constantly changing. So then, when I'm thinking about this, admitting to what we do not know, we can use curiosity as key to firstly admit what we do not know. And when we admit it, we can ask better questions from the place of not knowing something, and through those better questions have a better capacity to understand what we're trying to understand. But and then I suppose this is kind of the keen reflective practice also, that if we are coming from a place that we want to say that we know everything, then there's not really any point in reflecting, because what we're reflecting is something that we want to know, something we do not know. So, as I see it, admitting to what we don't know to develop a practice, use curiosity as key to find those things unknown, accompanied with some imagination, would be the most important tool to develop a reflective practice or to learn more something about yourself or someone else. But still, using this, the unknown of the human mind is not something that generally comes across when we're being taught to operate in different climates. So that's why I kind of lifted it up.
Yeah, and I think that could be a really important addition that I've not heard too much of, being curious and staying curious and questioning things and asking questions, acknowledging and being aware of what we don't know yet. Um, and I think that would be, we talked about, following successful people. And obviously that's a whole other conversation around how do we define success, and should we even be following that,
Mm,
those models. But I think that if we look at success as people who've achieved a high level in their respective fields, that curiosity and the willingness to
mm.
learn would probably be something that comes up quite a lot.
Yes, curiosity as key and making the unknown your best friend, really. And when I'm doing some guidance or coaching on teaching in the fields of psychology and mind, it doesn't necessarily need to be sports, but in any case, investigating the mind and our capacity in this life as a human, I kind of try to encourage people to just drop who they are for a bit and just step out. What you think you know, just leave it now outside for a little bit and kind of be courageous enough to step in this field of really experiencing not knowing. That let's think a bit that we don't know anything, and now, when we look at this information presented to us, would we look at it a different way? Would we map it a different way? What would we notice differently if we were not hanging on to these thoughts, beliefs of what we think we know about ourselves or someone else? So I feel that it's a way that is very helpful and supportive if we want to create new trajectories in thought patterns of ways of seeing the world, or why not for reflective practices to kind of come from a place from not knowing, which is more bigger than the information that we think we know, which is generally a bit small. Like it's somewhat of a cliche that the more you read, the more you study, the less you know. So coming from this kind of an angle. Okay.
Yeah.
But this is also a really big subject I could just talk about for a long time. So instead, we're going to move to our final point. So some do's and don'ts about reflection. You said in general, it's not something that is often taught for coaches by different coaching educators. But if you were to teach someone to create their own reflective practice, what would you see that are the key issues there?
Yeah, I think initially I want to ask the coach, where do you want to be? An awareness of having some direction. Like for you, what is a good coach? What is a successful coach for you? And then having them verbalize that, then maybe write it down or at least become aware of it. Then start to think about themselves, right? So where are you at the minute? So we've got this idea of what the good coach looks like, what you want to be.
Mm.
Where are you right now? And then start to have some question in there around the coach's current behaviors, performances, practices, at least just to make them more aware of their current style. Next, it would be around the strengths, like what are you actually good at? You know, and here, this is where I think that this idea of like a 360 kind of appraisal and asking other people, it, and I think this is where people might be reticent to do it, but asking athletes, players, managers, mentors, colleagues, like, I think it's very difficult. But what do you think about my practice? What are my strengths and what else can I develop? So this way we're getting more awareness, and I think people would be surprised. I've never even considered this as a strength of mine, as
Mm.
one of my resources that I can now access. Um, then when we're approaching problems
Mm.
and trying to address mistakes, that's where we go. As we mentioned earlier on, it's solution focused. It's accepting the things that are out of our control. As you mentioned, we're not trying to control them, but what are the things that we can control? What are the things that we can influence? And what are our resources available to do that? So having people actually list or think up of the different resources that they can use to solve a problem. So
Mm.
we are more solutions focused rather than just repetitive thinking. We don't go into the rumination cycle. And you touched on this a bit earlier on. Those resources. Is it tangible? So is it something that I've got? Something that can help me, whether it's equipment, facilities, space. Often it's informational. So what information can I access to help me with this? And especially now, there's a lot of coaching information out there. It can be a bit overwhelming. So maybe finding trusted sources of information that you go to, whether it's online or whether it's another individual. And that brings in the social resource. So
Mm.
who are the people that I've got? One of the most useful things that I did last year as a coach, I met with another coach friend of mine. And I was having a problem on the field, more of a tactical thing. I just asked the coach, said, how would you coach this? They gave me like loads of different ways that they would approach the problem. And I was thinking, okay, I won't use that one, but maybe that one's going to work. I'm kind of writing things down and drawing it. So the social resources is obviously huge. Helping somebody else, having someone else stimulate that reflection. So using an awareness of our own skills and abilities and both the tangible information and social resources, being aware of those so that we can have a more solutions based approach to reflection, which is gonna help us grow. Um,
Mm.
Whether we're addressing correct performance, good performance, or negatives and mistakes, we're always looking for further growth. So we can ideally treat both the same and have a less kind of intense emotional response if things are going badly.
Yes. I would see that humans, we are a part of nature. And in that sense, we have inbuilt want and will and desire to grow, to develop, just as everything else. And I can imagine that if we do not grow and develop, even if we are like in our comfort zone and seemingly comfortable, it still gets to us through negative emotions if we stand still, because we do have this inbuilt desire to move forward, which makes this like solution-based reflection really important. Maybe some tips I would think about, not being a professional of reflection, but what have come to my mind are, for instance, to build somewhat of a focus map of change. And what I mean by that is that since we've been talking about, the positive reflection and then the negative and then rumination and strengths and deficits based, to make sure that let's say you're a person who may tend this ruminative practice, like, okay, we're not trying to completely take that away and completely change you, or I don't want to completely change me if you're thinking about it to yourself, but sets a limit on it, like a limit you will follow. So let's say you're allowed to focus on the mistakes 20% of this time frame or 25%, and then the rest you focus on the strengths. So how that goes in practice is that you set yourself 1 hour to design like a map what you want to focus on, and from that 1 hour you're allowed to focus on mistakes maximum 15 minutes, and the rest, the 45 minutes, you push yourself to focus on strengths, which can slowly start perhaps to alter this ruminative mindset if you are carrying that with you. Or then on the other side, if you notice that, okay, I'm maybe being a bit defensive and like overly focusing on the strengths and avoiding to be face to face with my weakness, then you switch it the other way around. And in this sense, you challenge yourself to maybe move your thought patterns out of the normal and see what that does. And then one thing also that came to my mind from this is that generally we people do like to kind of gather other people around us who share the same opinions as us and kind of live and do life in similar ways as we do. But it can also be really helpful to have a person, someone to have conversations with who has completely different opinions than you. So for instance, I have a friend in my life, and it's really annoying to talk with this person because their opinions are completely different to mine, and their way of seeing things is completely different to mine. But I cannot I need to also admit that this person is very smart, very successful, and they are going the way they want to go in life and are also generally happy in their life. So things are working out. And I know when they're doing these opinionated conversations to me, it's a point of wanting you to grow as well. So to have this kind of a person who does challenge you, it doesn't need, like, every conversation does not need to be a challenge, but someone you can listen to and consider, like, is there actually a point in what they're saying? It's completely different to how I'm thinking and how I'm reflecting on things. But is there actually a point? Like, is this actually working? Is this something I could also sometimes ask myself or look at myself or so? Like, these kind of things came to my mind. And then the last one, which was actually, I think, one of your publications, there was a coach who mentioned 3 to thrive or something like this. And the general
Mhm.
idea was to have a time to think of 3 things you are grateful for, then 3 outcomes you want to focus on, and then things which can be 3 things again, which are positive, strength-based, you can say to your teammates or colleagues. And then, as you said, also ask for feedback on your own practice and your own strengths. So those are something that came to my mind on this note.
Yeah. No, I think they're all really useful. The first point, I'm thinking back to those reflective questions and prompts, and you're talking
Mm,
about maybe having a certain um, amount or ratio of kind of errors so that we don't spend too long on those, but we're also aware of it. So,
mm,
yeah, I think that for whether it's for coaches or people working with coaches to come up with a series of reflexive questions that work for them. Have I been here before? What did I do? What was the outcome? And what can I take into this situation? So yeah, I think having those prompt ready and particularly when the pressure's on and we can just access those rather than, I guess there's tunnel vision and there's also almost like nebulous thinking where there's almost too much information and what do I pick? So having those reflective prompts and questions that can anchor us. Um, I think that is a really useful point around having an individual that can challenge what we do. Um,
Mm,
and certainly thinking back to my coaching career and having different co-coaches, sometimes we would work with a team together. Um, in the best scenario, I had a coach who was very different
mm,
experience, was an ex-player. We would disagree on things, but it would always be it would be in a useful way, and the the gaps in my knowledge, he was stronger there, whereas I probably brought other stuff into the equation. If you've got someone that's exactly the same as you and thinks the
mm,
same and agrees, there's no point in having that other person there.
mm,
So yeah,
mm,
having somebody that is curious as well in a way that helps you to learn and think about things in a different way. I
mm.
think that's really, really good. What was your last one? It was
Free
good.
to
I forgot.
thrive.
Yeah, yeah, I should remember that one. Yeah, because that was in my study. Yeah, I thought that was really cool because so that coach with the Three to Thrive was talking about when she had first gone into a job, how the atmosphere was kind of toxic and negative,
Mm,
and it was just about getting her athletes to think about things that are good,
mm,
because there was
mm,
a lot of complaining perhaps about the program and things had not gone well the previous season and maybe the previous coach. So just to get those athletes kind of appreciating each other, appreciating where they're at, acknowledging each other's strengths. And that could kind of change that performance climate, particularly by doing it every day. And now the players,
mm.
they kind of know that it's coming up, right? Coach is going to ask me tomorrow what I'm thankful for, what I'm good at, what
Yeah.
I want to achieve today. So really directing the questions
Mm,
towards strengths, which was
mm.
a really, really cool technique.
Yeah, especially in the time of stress and in the time of high pressure, I think like that's the time when this kind of free to thrive strategies can be very helpful because when you're in the game, in the pressure, at least how I think about it, it may not be so beneficial to focus on the mistakes in that moment when the pressure is already on and everything is happening. Like we can do that after the game, but perhaps in that moment to get your athletes a bit more like encouraged and get their self-efficacy up, which is needed in the game. This kind of very quick, for instance, three to thrive, like what you say to them and what you put the focus on can be helpful and also adaptable in the setting, which is generally very fast paced. So you don't have a lot of minutes necessarily to start like talking about issues and so forward, and everybody's pumped up so their attentional span is already narrow, so you need to have very like solid quick focus points on what you want them to be focused on. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for this conversation. And yeah, I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed talking with you, and let's see if we have some other ones in the future. But for now, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any last thoughts you want to say here?
Well, no, thank you, Ruth. Yeah, really good conversation. And it's made me reflect. Some of the points you've
Yes.
raised as well. So, um, yeah, it's been interesting to talk about these, and hopefully it's useful for coaches and people working outside of sport as well.
Exactly. We ended up having a reflective conversation. So that's really the best way that this could have gone. Hey, thank you.